Few places in American history witnessed more suffering than the vast plantations of the antebellum South. For generations, these sprawling estates were built on the backs of enslaved laborers who toiled under the unforgiving southern sun, driven by the crack of a whip. Beneath the genteel facade of plantation life, brutally reigned. The United States of America was built on the ideals of liberty, freedom, and equality. At least, that's what the history books often tell us. But the reality? A different story altogether. Absconded from the household of the President of the United States, Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl. $10 will be paid to any person who will bring her home, reads one advertisement commissioned by George Washington. Another from Andrew Jackson reads, "Stop the runaway, $50 reward, and an extra 10 for every 100 lashes any person will give him." Slavery was at one time the cog in the American industrial machine, and the plantation was its beating heart, fueled by human suffering. Beneath the stately homes and the sophistication of upper-class society lay a world ruled by fear, violence, and cruelty. Welcome to the infamous past, where we uncover the brutal truths buried beneath history. Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was one of America's most revered founding fathers. He spoke of liberty and the equality of all men. Yet at Monticello, in his Virginia plantation, those ideals were nowhere to be found. More than 600 enslaved men, women, and children lived under his ownership as his personal property. Jefferson may have philosophized about emancipation, but in practice, Monticello operated like any other plantation, where obedience was demanded and cruelty was the price of rebellion. Jefferson relied on overseers to enforce his authority, selecting men known for brutality. William McGehee, William Page, and Gabriel Lilly were among them, their whips and fists ensuring no act of resistance went unpunished. Jefferson particularly respected Lilly, praising his ability to maintain order and extract labor, being fully aware that his methods were rooted in violence. Punishments were swift. Young boys were whipped, while runaways were often sold away, permanently separated from their families. And then there was Sally Hemings. Jefferson didn't just own his slaves, he fathered children with them. Hemings, an enslaved woman, bore him multiple children. By law, they were his property. Though they received slightly better treatment than others, they still remained property. 2 were allowed to leave during Jefferson's lifetime, while the others would be freed only after Jefferson's death. He did not extend this privilege to any other enslaved children. A lifetime of service was expected from Jefferson's slaves, and so escape attempts were common and met with swift retribution. James Hubbard, one of Jefferson's enslaved workers, tried to flee, but was recaptured a year later. He was whipped, imprisoned, and sold. Despite his legacy as a soldier against tyranny, Jefferson profited handsomely from slavery, enforcing its brutality through men like Lilly and McGehee. However, years later, he was nearly bankrupt, and after death, his enslaved workers were auctioned off, reduced to nothing more than commodities once again. Franklin and Armfield. By the 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade was banned, but slavery itself was thriving within America. No firm was more powerful in this industry than Franklin and Armfield. Founded in 1828, the firm didn't just participate in the domestic slave trade, it dominated it. From their headquarters in Alexandria, Virginia, they orchestrated the forced migration of thousands of men, women, and children into the Deep South, where conditions were even more brutal. Franklin and Armfield specialized in buying enslaved people from the Upper South, where declining tobacco profits made them expendable, and selling them to the booming cotton and sugar plantations of Mississippi and Louisiana. They packed their captives into overland caravans or crammed them onto ships bound for New Orleans. The journey was grueling. Shackled together, the enslaved marched hundreds of miles in blistering heat. Those who faltered were whipped, and those who collapsed were left by the roadside to die. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Franklin and Armfield's empire was their trafficking of sex slaves. Light-skinned women, labeled as fancy maids, were in high demand, also referred to as quadroons or octoroons, fetching prices 4 to 5 times higher than field laborers. The firm's members swapped women between themselves, with Isaac Franklin and his nephew James treating them as personal property. James Franklin described his uncle's nightly abuse, calling it very boyish behavior. For Isaac Franklin, this was not just business, it was a path to immense wealth. With profits soaring, he retired to a vast Tennessee plantation, where he continued to exploit enslaved people until his death. John Armfield followed a similar path, living in luxury built on the suffering of thousands. Franklin and Armfield did not merely facilitate slavery, they fueled its expansion, turning human trafficking into an efficient, ruthless industry. Their empire thrived on cruelty, and for those caught in their grip, the journey south was often a one-way descent into unimaginable suffering. Shockoe Bottom and Lumpkins Jail. Richmond, Virginia, was one of the largest hubs of the American slave trade, and at its heart lay Shockoe Bottom, a sprawling marketplace where thousands of enslaved people were bought and sold. For decades, this district functioned as the center of the American slave trade, second only to New Orleans, where traders and buyers haggled over lives with the same detachment as they would livestock. At the center of this brutality was Lumpkins Jail, infamously called the Devil's Half Acre. Run by Robert Lumpkin, this prison was a place of relentless suffering. Lumpkin even built a specialized whipping room that allowed him to bind his victims by their forelimbs, holding them still as he flogged them. The inmates of Lumpkin's jail awaited their fate in filthy, overcrowded conditions, their bodies battered from constant abuse. The jail was infamous for its torture. Prisoners were whipped, chained, and starved. Captured runaways were humiliated with public beatings and whippings. Women suffered a particular horror in Lumpkin's jail. Many were kept in isolation and subjected to sexual violence by Lumpkin himself, as well as by traders and buyers who treated them as property for both labor and pleasure. Enslaved women were also forcibly impregnated by other slaves. Those involved had hoods placed on their heads, so they did not know their child's father or mother, which in some cases could be their brother, sister, or even their own mother. One of the most famous residents of Lumpkin's jail was Anthony Burns. He escaped slavery in Virginia in 1854, but was later captured in Boston and tried under the Fugitive Slave Act. His recapture caused public outrage amongst the abolitionist North, and after 4 months in Lumpkin's jail, his freedom was purchased by an abolitionist group. Shockoe Bottom and Lumpkin's jail were not just places of commerce, they were factories of human misery. Beneath the surface of Richmond's economy was an industry built on unimaginable suffering, where traders like Robert Lumpkin turned cruelty into profit, ensuring the slave trade remained alive and thriving in the heart of the South. Slavery in America began in 1619, when the first enslaved Africans were brought to the English colony of Virginia. What started as a small-scale practice soon grew into a vast, brutal industry with millions of men, women, and children trafficked, exploited, and treated as property. Over the course of more than 2 centuries, an estimated 12 million Africans were forcibly taken across the Atlantic, with nearly 400,000 arriving in what would later become the United States. From the tobacco fields of Virginia to the cotton plantations of the Deep South, slavery fueled the nation's economy at the cost of thousands of human lives. The institution was finally abolished after the Union's victory in the Civil War, but freedom did not bring true equality. The end of slavery was followed by decades of racial oppression, from black codes to Jim Crow laws, ensuring that the struggle for justice continued long after the last physical shackles were removed. Today, we remember not just the horrors, but the resilience of those who suffered. Their voices, though silenced then, must never be forgotten. What are your thoughts on this dark chapter of history? Did any of these facts surprise you? Let us know in the comments. And if you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us uncover more hidden truths from the past.